So we've made our way up to Wakefield and we're in Team 17's office, and Kevin has joined us and he's going to tell us about the new Worms game, Worms WMD, or would you prefer us to call it Worms Weapons of Mass Destruction?
Well, its title is actually Worms WMD. That's what we refer to it internally. We don't really have a full title for it, I wouldn't say. Certainly not as you just presented it there. So this is the latest entry in the Worms series. It's the new main entry in the Worms series. It's for PC and Xbox One. This is a 2D version of the game. It adds a lot of new features. We're trying to walk a balance between keeping the simplicity of the Worms games that the series is famous for, but add an extra layer of strategy to it with 1 or 2 additions.
Okay, so one of the things, one of the new features that you just mentioned is the new vehicles. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Of course, yes. So one of the new vehicles that we're putting into the game is the tank. I think anybody who's a long-time fan of the series will recognise this as a really cool new feature. It's a really cool new addition. Tanks, I would say, add an extra layer of strategy to the game, because the tank, I mean, it acts like a tank as you would expect. Drive it left and right. This tank, unlike most real-life tanks, can also jump, which we found is quite handy for getting around the kind of undulating landscapes that Worms throws up. It bestows a lot of extra power to the person who takes control of the vehicle, so it can fire a volley of shells. It helps with things like crossing dangerous minefields. If you're within the tank, it protects you from damage. It acts a little bit like an armoured shell. You can fall greater distances within the tank without taking damage. And we just found that as soon as we put them into the game, in fact the first time that we played the game with the tank, everybody all of a sudden wanted to be inside the tank. You know, it wasn't cool to not be in the tank anymore. I think it's important to say that we've taken a lot of the game's balancing into consideration. At the same time, we didn't want the vehicles to necessarily be a foreconclusion, as in you get into the tank, you've won the game. So the tank is, I suppose the way that it works is it fires a barrage of shells. It's quite hard to concentrate the tank's fire. There's an element of skill involved. Sometimes it makes more sense to use one of the game's existing weapons already. So we're keeping that balance of strategy in the game.
Okay, one thing that definitely will change people's strategies with the game is you've introduced new buildings, and they work very, very differently to what people would have known before and will remember from previous Worms games.
Yeah, well, the buildings, I would say, really come into their own in multiplayer matches. This is the first time in a Worms game where we've had anything like this. Ordinarily in Worms, landscape is landscape. You see the shape, you can blow it up, you can use it to take cover, you can hide behind it, so on and so forth. The buildings, from the outside, I say from the outside because if you're not inside a building, you see the exterior of the building. When you go inside the building, what you see in the game is the front of the landscape fades down, and that reveals a cross-section of the building, and they act like mini fortresses. So again, it's an area of the landscape which I say plays to the strategic strengths of the game. If you get inside a building, your worms that are inside the building are hidden from view to everybody outside the building. They're really cool because you can hole up in there. It's a place where you might fire out from the windows. Anybody who's on the outside, they're trying to blow the building up, rattle grenades in through the doorways and through the windows and so on, things like that. They're like mini fortresses which allow you to take a little bit of extra cover, allow you to hide your worms away, and they play in really nicely to the multiplayer element of the game.
Okay, so one thing that you could say about the buildings is kind of also ties into another element that I wanted to talk to you about, which is kind of the procedural generation of the levels and the art style, and the two are inextricably linked. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've changed kind of the design and the way that you build the levels, and how the buildings and the way that everything's laid out, how that changes the game now?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the first thing to say about this is the game's all 2D. Of course, it's all new artwork, beautiful, high definition. Everything is handcrafted digital paintings. So it's got a very strong art style to begin with. And when we've made Worms games in the past, oftentimes we've been using a similar approach to generating the landscape that we've been using right from the very first game. You know, the approach to creating the landscapes hasn't really changed since the very first version of Worms. And what we found from looking at this was that no matter how good the artwork was, no matter how good a job the artist did, every version of Worms that we created kind of looks similar to the previous versions. And the times when Worms looks best is when we have an artist sit down and they can just go wild, they can paint whatever they like, they've got complete control over the look of the landscape, and that's kind of the look that we wanted to get for all of the game. We wanted the random landscape generator, which is a big part of Worms, to always look like it was presenting a hand-drawn piece of art. And so we took a completely different approach for this. What we essentially did was we had a series of landscape pieces, all of them hand-drawn, and then we tried a new approach for generating landscapes whereby the random landscape generator has some intelligence about each piece. It knows what a piece of say base landscape is, it knows what a building is, it knows what a traffic light is, or a bridge is, or a washing line, and it can layer up all these hand-drawn pieces of artwork to create what looks like hand-drawn painting each and every time. So it's more like a picture generator or a scene generator. There were some reservations about this at first because it was unknown territory for us. We'd never developed anything like this before, but we set to work fairly early on in development building a prototype to prove this tech, and I think the results are quite striking. It has a perfect blend of getting the amount of variety in the landscapes that the Worms games are famous for, and which is so important because more variety in the landscapes leads to more variety in the multiplayer matches, can help make the multiplayer matches more fun, but at the same time now the landscape should look more like a proper piece of artwork, like trying to make everything look like it's hand-authored.
Okay, something else that you've redesigned is the actual worms themselves. Can you tell us a bit about the new design?
Yeah, sure. So we've redesigned the worms a couple of times throughout the brand's history. It's been a long time since I would say that we straight up redesigned him. We've usually settled on a style and then we've tweaked the formula a little bit, we've played with him, but he's always broadly looked the same. This new worm, he's all new, he is a redesign. We're looking for something that looks a bit more contemporary, something that looks a bit more modern. It takes its cues from modern kids' cartoon shows. Another thing to say about that is harks back to the landscape. The two art styles are purposefully contrasting, so the landscape looks like hand-painted images. The worm is a lot simpler, he's clean lines, he's a little bit more angular, and that's intentionally done because it makes it visually more easy to read for the player. It's obvious what should be the landscape and what are the interactive elements on the landscape, such as vehicles, landmines, oil drums, worms, etc.
Okay, one of the things that we saw when we were playing the demo is you've got the usual kind of customization options. What can you tell us about that side of the game and what players will be able to do to kind of differentiate their little worms from the opposition?
Well, it's a lot of the things that you've seen in previous games. So you saw hats in the game there. There is the funny speech banks. The things that the worms can say are very different. Obviously, the mainstay of the series, you can name your team, you can name your worms. The things that are really iconic of the series and are a staple of the series.
Okay, one thing that fans, long-time fans, will be certainly interested to hear about is the old favourite ninja rope. So what can you tell us about its introduction this time around? Is it going to be the classic ninja rope that old school players will know well?
It absolutely is the classic ninja rope that old school players will know well. In fact, I would go as far to say it is the ninja rope. It is exactly the ninja rope. We know because we've got a fan base. We've got a fan base stretching back across all the versions of Worms before. Ninja rope is something that a lot of our fans care passionately about, and they're right to as well, because the ninja rope in some versions of Worms was really cool, and it's a really cool thing in video games. And you know, we haven't always replicated that to the best of our abilities for various reasons, but this time round, yeah, 100% the classic ninja rope.
One thing that I've always wondered about: how do you balance kind of coming up with kind of quirky new weapons with kind of servicing fan expectations to see kind of old favourite returning in each new iteration?
Well, at Team 17, I think there are some weapons that are absolutely sacrosanct. You can't have worms without the bazooka and the grenade. You can't have worms without the ninja rope either, really. And then looking down the list, there are a number of weapons which give it its flavour. Holy hand grenade, banana bomb, old lady, sheep. So we always make sure that we tick those boxes and we get good implementations of those weapons in first. Beyond that, sometimes we'll design a weapon based on a pun or something that we just think is funny or a bit silly, and then sometimes we'll look at the new features. So what weapons would complement the new features of the game? You know, if the new features are buildings or vehicles, is there anything that might complement those new features that would sit alongside those new features? Or we might just play a few games and just shoot a few ideas around, you know, wouldn't it be cool if, or what strategies would we like here, or what is it that we've introduced that we need a weapon to counter. So sometimes based on fan service, sometimes based on funnies and jokes, and sometimes based on the gameplay and the strategy.
So one thing about Worms is that you've released a lot of games over the years, and whilst on the surface they may all look very similar, there's a lot of nuance to them, and they can kind of feel very different to one another. If you had to kind of compare what WMD to kind of one of the older games, what do you think? What kind of atmosphere are you trying to capture? What kind of game are you trying to evoke?
It's simply Worms Armageddon. There's something about Worms Armageddon that's meant that it's lived long in the memory for a lot of Worms fans. Consistently, it's the one that we hear comes out top in fan favourites, and I think the reasons for that are quite hard to get across. You know, you'd know if you played the game. There's a certain feeling of weight to things. There's a certain feeling of solidity in the physics. Just feels really great to play. You know, it's a really nice version of Worms, and we took a lot of cues from that to the point that I'd probably say that even though it's a whole new engine, it's massively influenced. It takes a lot of cues from Worms Armageddon, and that same great feeling when you play the game that comes from playing Worms Armageddon, that's exactly what we're aiming for with WMD.
Okay, so how long have you been working with WMD? What kind of stage is it at in its development?
That's actually quite difficult for me to say. I don't think I can give you an exact number because we don't really have a final release date yet. The new features, like the brand new features, they've been in for a couple of months, and the version that we played today, for example, that's not finished. You know, that's still got a little ways to go in terms of ironing out a couple of the wrinkles in all sorts of different things, how the vehicles feel, how it reacts to the landscape, what it looks like, exactly how it sounds. So there's still a little way in terms of development to go. I'd say that a lot of the new features are there. They're working. We're playing them. We're enjoying the game. We're seeing what it adds to the game. But there's still a few rough edges to polish off.
Okay, at the beginning of the interview, you mentioned that the game is coming to PC and Xbox. Are there plans to bring it to any other platforms further down the line?
At the moment, it's coming to Xbox One and PC first.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
You're mildly annoying.